The story begins with a punch. At Albany Cathedral, a newly ordained priest named Judd, due to some minor disagreements, clashed with a deacon and punched him, injuring him. Although it was only a punch, the deacon was diagnosed with a moderate concussion. In the church, fighting among clergy was an extremely serious matter. Because of this, Judd was reprimanded and transferred to a small, remote church to work as an assistant pastor. Hearing the news, Judd's heart, which had been hanging in the balance, finally calmed down. However, the bishop immediately warned him not to celebrate too soon, as the situation at that church was quite complicated. The church was built in the 1960s. Although small in scale, Father Jefferson had a peculiar temperament. He had always disobeyed the church's management and arrangements. Judd would be going to Our Lady of Perpetual Fortitude Church, headed by Jefferson. The priest said that Jefferson had his supporters here, but I wasn't one of them. He thought Jefferson was a real jerk. But one thing was undeniable: he had become conservative. There might be a need for something that Judd had demonstrated. The priest hoped Judd would quickly establish a good relationship with Jefferson, familiarize himself with local customs, and ideally take complete control of the church before the priest retired. Judd thought it would be an easy job. He immediately packed his bags and went there. However, unexpectedly, the so-called small church was anything but small. Its size and decorations rivaled those of some larger churches. But when Judd entered, he was surprised to find there was no statue of Jesus. Just as he was feeling doubtful, a priest entered through the door. That was Jefferson, the church's caretaker. Despite Judd slightly annoyed by Jefferson's cold, sarcastic remarks, he understood he had to be patient. While they were talking, a woman appeared from behind. Her name was Martha, the church's deacon. When she learned that Judd was the newly appointed assistant, a flicker of confusion appeared in Martha's eyes. She offered a brief greeting and hurried away. Although Jefferson harbored resentment towards the church's arrangements, he was still nominally the head of the area. He was obligated to unconditionally obey the church's orders. He arranged for Judd to stay in the resting area in the backyard. As he adjusted to his surroundings, Judd vaguely sensed a special connection between Jefferson and Martha. Besides Jefferson and Martha, the church also had a maintenance worker named Sam who handled all the church's repairs. After unpacking, Judd immediately went to his room. Sam's attitude was quite enthusiastic. Not only did he welcome Judd's arrival, but he also gave him a brief overview of the church. Jefferson was in charge, a strange but kind-hearted man. Martha was even more wonderful. She was not only the goddess Sam had secretly loved for 40 years, but also an all-powerful figure in the church. From daily tasks, managing finances, organizing documents, to playing the organ during prayers, she did it all herself. Over the next few weeks, Judd began to familiarize himself with the church's work. The church wasn't small, but there wasn't much to do. Besides welcoming Christian believers to weekly services, there was basically nothing to do on weekdays. That afternoon, Judd was incredibly bored, so he went to the backyard. He discovered a strange little room, its walls covered with random drawings. Sam was cleaning it with tools. Judd thought it was a wine cellar, but Martha told him that Prentice, the founder of the church, was buried inside. It turned out that Jefferson's grandfather had built the church. After Prentice's death, Jefferson took over its management, and it remained there to this day. Seeing Sam's busy figure, Judd remembered the missing cross in the middle of the church. So he took out the cross and planned to make a new statue of Jesus. But Jefferson stopped him. It turned out the reason the church lacked a cross was because of a woman named Grace. This woman not only removed the cross but also smashed many of the church's decorations. Jefferson deliberately didn't repair it, using it as a warning to future generations. Driven by curiosity, Judd sought out Martha to ask about this old story. To his surprise, the woman who vandalized the church, Grace, was Jefferson's own mother, going back several decades. At that time, Jefferson's grandfather, Prentice, was a leading tycoon with hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Not disliking the deceitfulness of the business world, he brought his daughter Grace back to their hometown, built this church, and adopted Martha, an orphaned girl. However, Grace was not content with her lot. She not only dressed provocatively, but also frequented bars. One night, she spent the night with a vagrant. She subsequently became pregnant and gave birth to Jefferson. Although Prentice was deeply disappointed by his daughter's behavior, he accepted the reality and promised to leave his entire inheritance to Grace in exchange for her raising the child properly. However, one day, Grace was wandering outside when she suddenly returned home. But not to attend her father's funeral, she rushed straight to her lawyer to claim her entire inheritance. After discovering that her father's account was empty, she went completely insane. She rushed into the church and smashed the cross and all sorts of decorations. Even young Martha was not lucky enough to escape being beaten in a fight. Finally, Grace ran to her father's grave and chose to do something reckless. Because of his mother's death, Jefferson didn't even know who his biological father was. Therefore, he intensely hated Grace. The decorations and cross in the church were never repaired. Knowing Knowing about the church's past, Judd couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. However, what surprised him even more was yet to come. During the next service, Judd found Jefferson's sermon terrible. He brazenly spoke about the impropriety of women in front of children, causing some parishioners to angrily leave their seats. Besides the sermon, Judd discovered other problems. The church's accounts were in utter chaos. A large portion of the money had been embezzled by Jefferson, and a significant amount of that charity money came from a disabled girl named Ellie. Judd believed this was a deception of the believers, so Judd sought out Jefferson, hoping he could rectify the situation. However, when confronted, Jefferson not only ignored him but also punched Judd. Faced with Jefferson's arrogance, Judd was so angry he almost wanted to retaliate, but he remembered the bishop's teaching that if violence could solve everything, then faith would lose its meaning. After calming down, Judd decided to gather evidence to expose Jefferson's actions to the public. However, he didn't know that Jefferson was not someone to be trifled with. Discovering that Judd was investigating his embezzlement of donations, Jefferson, in collusion with Martha, began to isolate him after the service. Jefferson forbade him from attending Mass, even on prayer days, and wouldn't allow him near the assembly hall. Unable to tolerate it any longer, he stormed in, but Jefferson chased him out. Extremely angry, Judd ran to a bar and got drunk. Before leaving, he grabbed the devil-shaped ornament from the table lamp. Then, in a fit of rage, he smashed the church window. At the next service, Judd finally got an opportunity to speak. He intended to use this opportunity to expose Jefferson's embezzlement of the donations. However, just as he stepped onto the platform to speak, he turned around and saw Jefferson had fainted on the floor in the small room next to where the world's salvation was being given. Seeing Jefferson collapse, Judd and everyone present were overjoyed. Judd went to check on him and found Jefferson's back covered in blood. A devil-shaped ornament was stuck in Jefferson's back, the very thing he had stolen from the bar the night before. This sudden sight terrified everyone. Dr. Sharp told Judd to step outside. Then he took a white handkerchief from his pocket and sat down to check if Jefferson was still breathing. At that very moment, Martha suddenly let out a scream. Her scream drew everyone's attention. When they turned, they saw Dr. Sharp pulling a dagger from Jefferson's back. After confirming Jefferson's murder, Martha immediately called the police. But by the time the ambulance arrived, Jefferson had already died. Investigators from the local police department quickly arrived at the scene. Because of the clear conflict between Judd and Jefferson, he became the prime suspect and was taken to the police station for questioning. Judd described the events to Detective Chief Scott. At that moment, Jefferson finished his speech and went into a small room next door. When Judd turned around, he found Jefferson unconscious on the ground. Judd approached and discovered a dagger embedded in Jefferson's back. Although Judd was a serious suspect, the police lacked direct evidence and could not detain him. They let him go home first. At the same time, they instructed him not to leave town during the investigation. News of Jefferson's murder made Judd the center of town gossip. Most of the parishioners believed he was the one who killed Jefferson. Faced with the strange looks from everyone, Judd was deeply troubled. He truly hated Jefferson, but he would absolutely not use this method to compete for power. He returned to the church dejectedly and knelt to confess his sins before the cross. Just as he was wondering what to do, the large doors of the church were pushed open. A man appeared at the door. This man was Blancc, a famous detective. He was disguised as a parishioner coming to confess, but halfway through his sentence, he suddenly changed the subject to Judd. Blancc said he was interested in Jefferson's murder case. Because there were no clues at the crime scene, the police had asked Blancc to assist in the investigation. Even with just a brief encounter, Blancc had already deduced that Judd was not the killer, so Blancc invited Judd to join him in solving the case and finding the real killer. Knowing that the person before him was the renowned detective who had solved the Kentucky case, Judd was overjoyed. He immediately accepted. The two first went to the morgue. They heard from the forensic pathologist that Jefferson's cause of death was a dagger piercing his heart from behind, causing cardiac arrest. Blancc carefully examined the body and confirmed the forensic conclusion. Then, following Judd's description, the group went to the bar and confirmed that the devil-shaped ornament on the dagger had been removed from a lamppost. Furthermore, someone had already attached it to the dagger and painted it red. However, during the crime scene investigation, Blancc discovered an anomaly. The lamppost in the photograph clearly had another devil-shaped ornament, but the lamppost at the scene was missing. The owner didn't know when the ornament had disappeared. Just as Blancc was frowning in thought, Judd happened to encounter Dr. Sharp not far away. Judd was about to greet him when Sharp angrily stormed out, shouting insults. After confirming the demonic decorations originated from the bar, Blancc led the group back to the church. They carefully examined the small room where Jefferson was murdered and reconstructed the events of that day's service. Everything was normal before Jefferson entered the room. He had been there for less than a minute when misfortune struck. Blancc speculated that the killer must have been hiding somewhere in the room to carry out the murder. However, the four walls of the small room were built of thick stone blocks. There was absolutely no place to hide. If the killer had been hiding, Jefferson could have seen them at a glance, making it impossible to complete the murder. Blancc immediately suggested another possibility. The killer might have used some kind of device or mechanism. However, this reasoning was quickly dismissed by Judd. Judd recalled Jefferson falling with his face turned toward the exit. This meant that if there was a device, the knife could only have been launched from the wall behind him. But if that were the case, Jefferson would have seen the device at a glance, and the assassination would be impossible. Blancc meticulously examined the small room. All the walls showed no signs of tampering. The only place with electrical equipment was an electrical box on the left, but its position didn't match the trajectory of the knife at all. Both hypotheses led to a dead end. At this moment, Blancc thought of a third possibility. Two thick red threads, about 3 inches thick, were down there, next to the body, near the hip. So what was the possibility? Knowing that the police had previously found 2 lengths of red thread at the scene, Blancc seemed to have figured something out. But just as the three were examining the room, Martha suddenly appeared in the church. She also asserted that Judd was the one who murdered Jefferson. She kept accusing him. Judd wanted to explain, but he didn't know where to begin. He went to Sam's shack and punched a sandbag to release his pent-up emotions. He then discovered Sam watching a recording of the baseball game that took place on the day of the murder. It turned out Sam had been busy filming at the church that day and hadn't had time to watch the game live, so he had recorded it beforehand. Judd suddenly remembered a deduction Blancc had mentioned. If there was some kind of device in the secret room, it would require high-frequency electromagnetic waves to penetrate the walls. These waves would typically interfere with surrounding electronic devices. Taking the recording with him, Judd went to see Blancc. The police carefully examined the tape and indeed found a clear signal interference in the frame the moment Jefferson entered the room. This meant the killer had indeed hidden some kind of device in the room beforehand. After Jefferson entered, it was activated, completing the murder. However, Blancc watched the tape and felt something was wrong. He placed the 2 tapes side by side and examined them carefully, discovering that the moment the baseball game image became distorted was precisely when Judd appeared at the door. If the device had been activated before Judd arrived, Jefferson should have collapsed in a pool of blood long ago, not been discovered only after Judd entered. As long as the device hadn't been activated at that time, it meant Jefferson was killed later. All previous deductions were invalid. Back at the church, Blancc told Judd carefully write down every detail of the day of the crime. He needed every minute detail. Judd had to try to remember and record every single detail of the service. When Blancc read what Judd had written, his expression suddenly changed. He replayed the recording and questioned Judd, asking what on earth he was doing. It turned out Judd had missed a crucial detail in his report. After Jefferson fainted, Judd was the first to enter the small room. The others arrived 9 seconds later. In those 9 seconds, Judd had ample time to carry out an assassination, but Blancc quickly softened his tone. Deep down, Blancc knew Judd wasn't lying. He just hadn't mentioned the 9 seconds alone. The reason Judd hadn't mentioned it was because he had done something at that time. He had taken the bottle of liquor Jefferson had hidden from the scene and concealed it. He wasn't trying to cover up a crime, but rather to save face for Jefferson. He didn't want Sam to know their promise to quit drinking had been silently broken, and that bottle of liquor was the most important piece of evidence in the entire assassination. Judd returned to the room to retrieve the bottle, but after searching around, he discovered it was gone. It was clear that what was in the bottle was definitely not wine, but possibly some kind of poison. In other words, Jefferson wasn't dead when he fell. He only fainted after drinking the contents of the bottle. The killer was also aware that Judd had taken the bottle, so he entered the room first to steal it. Thinking this far, Blancc guessed the killer's identity. However, lacking the crucial evidence, the bottle, he couldn't yet draw a conclusion. Early the next morning, the parishioners gathered at the church and began the funeral service for Jefferson. According to tradition, Jefferson and Prentice would be buried in a small room on the mountain behind the church. Looking at Jefferson, with whom she had worked for decades, Martha could hardly hide her emotions. As the forklift arrived, the stone door of the small room slowly opened. With the help of everyone, Jefferson's coffin was carried into the room. Blancc stood not far away, carefully observing the expressions on everyone's faces. But after observing for a long time, he still couldn't find anything unusual. The funeral ended, and everyone went to the prayer room. Every Sunday evening, Jefferson would be there for people to confess their sins. Now that Jefferson was gone, the parishioners were somewhat unable to accept it. While everyone was observing the priestly silence, Blancc entered the room to ask a few questions about the confession. He wanted to see if there were any clues. However, the crowd's response was rather strange. Ellie even angrily criticized Jefferson, calling him a fraud, not a priest. Hearing Ellie's words, Blancc felt something was amiss. Just as he was about to ask, Cy said that each confession was recorded. If Blancc wanted to see it, he could go into the small room inside to check. Knowing there was a recording, the parishioners who had been chatting suddenly became agitated. They rushed towards the door. Blancc realized that this group of parishioners who had gathered that day were definitely not just there for a regular confession. They were definitely hiding an unspeakable secret. Blancc told Judd to keep everyone outside. He watched a video himself. Through the recording, he finally figured out what had happened that night. They weren't confessing their sins, they were arguing loudly. Lawyer Vera was there, questioning Jefferson. It turned out she had accidentally learned from a colleague that Cy was Jefferson's illegitimate child. Jefferson had always publicly claimed he had never married. Even more absurdly, Jefferson not only refused to take any responsibility, but also secretly arranged for Vera to adopt the child through the church's welfare system. Vera raised the child for over a decade without knowing it was Jefferson's son. Feeling mocked, Vera loudly accused Jefferson of hypocrisy, but Cy had actually known the truth all along. It turned out that Vera had been the only one kept in the dark all along. Just as everyone was outraged by Jefferson's behavior, he suddenly announced even worse news. He not only declared the closure of the church, but also exposed the flaws of everyone present. Dr. Sharp was practicing while drunk. He dismissed another believer's work as worthless. He even bluntly told a female believer that her illness was due to a lack of faith. He couldn't do anything about it. Although he had promised to keep their secrets, everyone present had weaknesses in his hands. No one expected him to reveal everything to the crowd. Blancc watched the tape and suddenly understood. It turned out that everyone's strong reaction was because Jefferson knew each person's secrets. But then Blancc couldn't understand why Jefferson, if he had so many weaknesses in his hands, would want to reveal the reason he wanted to close the church. Blanc's gaze shifted to a secret that Cy had revealed. Not long ago, Jefferson discovered Prentice's inheritance amounted to $80 million. With that money, he could easily take Cy away and spend the rest of his life lavishly. Therefore, he decided to close the church. Before that, his decision to publicly reveal people's dark secrets was meant to distract the public and buy time. But ideals are perfect, while reality is harsh. Just one day before the church closed, Jefferson was assassinated. Before dying, he only left Cy a hint, without revealing the exact location of the fortune. Looking at the note, Blancc suspected it might be related to a bank account. He suggested checking Swiss banks. Cy felt it made sense, so he immediately left the church and rushed to a bank on the street. However, he was completely unaware that he had been tricked. As soon as Cy left, Blancc and Judd returned to Jefferson's office, simultaneously targeting a decorative item on the desk. Eva's apple wasn't a bank account at all, but a diamond that he had converted from his assets. They carefully disassembled the item, examining each part, but found nothing. Even the statue of Jesus was smashed, yet they still found nothing. Just as Judd was marveling at how $80 million from decades ago would have been worth several times more if it had been kept until today, he inadvertently found a receipt in his pocket. It was a receipt confirming a forklift order. The date was last Wednesday. This was strange. How could someone have ordered a forklift? Did the person who ordered it know Jefferson would die? Judd called the forklift company to check the orderer's identity. The person who ordered the forklift was Jefferson himself. Blancc became even more confused. Could Jefferson have known he would die the following Thursday? Blancc quickly realized there was something hidden behind this. Just as the two were about to piece together the clues, police sirens blared outside the church, and Blancc told Judd to flee immediately. It turned out that while reviewing the footage, Blancc had noticed a detail. Judd was the first to enter the small room, and the others arrived 9 seconds later. In those 9 seconds, Judd had ample time to carry out the murder. The police didn't notice at the time, but a careful review of the footage would quickly reveal the truth. Sure enough, Scott soon grasped this detail from the footage. He arrived with investigators. Judd didn't have time to think, so he chose to flee. As soon as he left, Scott arrived at the scene with his team. Blancc knew Judd wasn't the killer because he had already identified the real murderer. He simply didn't have concrete evidence yet. He asked Scott to wait a little longer. Then he ran up the mountain behind. As Judd passed Prentice's grave, he saw a strange sight. Jefferson emerged from the grave. Judd was stunned and hurriedly chased after him, wanting to see if the figure was indeed Jefferson. But he was afraid and slipped. When he got up, the man in black had disappeared into the bushes. Judd chased after him, but was struck by something. In his daze, he saw Jefferson holding a dagger and lunging towards him. When he opened his eyes again, he found the person lying on the ground had transformed into Sam. A scythe was around Sam's neck. Just as Judd was panicking, he heard the voices of Blancc and Scott not far away. He retreated into the woods in terror to hide. They ran to the scene and found a dead body in the bushes. Scott immediately sealed off the area. What surprised them even more was yet to come. They went to the small room and discovered Jefferson's body had disappeared. Luckily, Judd had installed a surveillance camera nearby to prevent vandalism. Scott immediately extracted the footage. Seeing Jefferson emerge from the coffin, both were stunned. A bold hypothesis formed in Scott's mind. Could Jefferson have faked his death? But Blancc quickly dismissed this possibility. He had personally examined the body and the knife that had pierced the victim's heart. It was impossible for the victim to still be alive. So if Jefferson was dead, why could he have come back to life? But the mystery didn't end there. The police collected fingerprints from the site next to Sam and found that all the fingerprints on the murder weapon belonged to Judd. Despite his doubts, Scott immediately issued a warrant for Judd's arrest. News of Jefferson's resurrection quickly spread among the believers. Everyone was in a panic. Dr. Sharp, in particular, was astonished and bewildered. Just as he was still reeling from the shock, the doorbell suddenly rang. He went to the door and saw a horrifying sight. Blancc was also shocked and confused by the situation. He carefully recalled all the clues he knew. The more he thought about it, the more something felt wrong. What he could confirm was that Jefferson had indeed died from a dagger to the heart. But if he was truly dead, why had he reappeared? Just as he was racking his brains and looked up, he saw Judd entering the police station. Judd had come to confess. Blancc quickly pulled him outside. It turned out that after Judd went into the bushes, he vaguely felt that he, in his panic, had killed Sam. That's why he came to confess. But Blancc said he hadn't killed Sam. Hearing Blancc mention Dr. Sharp, Judd was stunned. Could Dr. Sharp be the one who killed Jefferson? Filled with doubt, the two rushed to Dr. Sharp's house. As soon as Judd stepped through the door, he noticed the house was incredibly messy, as if someone had broken in. At that moment, Blancc smelled a foul odor. Following the scent, they went down to the basement. Judd immediately saw Jefferson, the missing man, lying face down in a metal bathtub. A terrible smell emanated from the tub. Blancc approached and saw that the liquid in the tub was strong acid. He turned on the water to flush it away. Another body, Dr. Sharp, immediately appeared in the tub. Although the body was severely corroded by the acid, Judd recognized him from the ring on his finger. This was indeed Dr. Sharp. Blancc searched the room. In a backpack on the corner of the desk, he found a bottle of tranquilizers. Looking at the name of the drug on the label, he finally understood the whole case. Blancc immediately contacted Scott and informed him of the new murder. At the same time, Blancc told him to inform all the churchgoers to gather at the church. He wanted to expose the truth to everyone. It was just dawn at that moment. Under everyone's watchful eyes, Blancc stepped onto the platform and, through words, recounted the events of that day's crime. Jefferson had entered the small room wanting a drink to sober up, unaware that the wine had been secretly replaced with tranquilizers. After drinking it all, he lost his ability to act and slowly fainted. The devil-shaped ornament that Judd mentioned had actually been sewn into the lining of the priest's robe beforehand. This type of robe was thick and heavy, so Jefferson was unaware that a small bag of blood was hidden inside the ornament. The killer used thread to tightly secure the bag of blood and the ornament to the inside of the robe. This was also the origin of the two red threads found at the scene. The signal interference was caused by the killer using a remote control to detonate the bag of blood at a specific moment. Although Judd was the first to investigate, he was not the culprit. A moment of distraction occurred, and the action was carried out as expected. His final task was to get rid of the vial containing the murderous drug. The only loophole in his plan was the result of Judd hiding the vial to cover up Jefferson's drinking habit. The killer intended to return later. However, when Blancc had only analyzed half of it, a ray of sunlight suddenly shone through a window into the church. Blancc stopped. After a moment of silence, he couldn't continue. He didn't want to reveal the next conclusion. Everyone present exchanged glances, wanting to clear himself of suspicion. Judd kept urging him on, but no matter how much the crowd questioned him, Blancc stubbornly refused to speak. Everyone lost patience and left one by one. Scott couldn't accept this result. He needed an explanation, because 3 murders had occurred in quick succession in the town. If the killer escaped, he would also find it difficult to shirk responsibility. But Blancc told him that the killer wouldn't get away. Soon the culprit would reveal himself. Scott was still skeptical when the church doors slowly opened. Martha entered and told Judd that she wanted to confess to him. As a pastor, he couldn't refuse and accepted her confession. It was during this confession that the whole affair finally began to unfold. Every event in this whole affair had to start with Prentice decades earlier. After joining the church, Prentice developed an obsession. He believed that wealth was the embodiment of sin and evil. Money not only eroded people's goodness, but also led to the degradation of humanity. Looking at Grace's appearance, this feeling became even more intense. To prevent this sin from being passed on to future generations, Prentice devised an extreme plan. He sold all his possessions and exchanged them for a priceless diamond. Then he swallowed the diamond, using his body to seal away the evil forever. Before he died, he told Martha everything and instructed her to keep it a secret forever. Although Prentice was very careful, Grace still discovered a clue. Through the base of the statue, she discovered that her father had likely exchanged all the money for diamonds. That day, after Prentice's burial, Grace rushed back to the church church to search for the diamond. She searched everywhere but found no trace. Coincidentally, Martha passed by and, without giving Grace an answer, coldly stated that she knew where the diamond was. But Grace would never find it. Grace was furious. When she stood before her father's grave, she couldn't understand why he had revealed the secret to an outsider instead of leaving it to her. This heartlessness became the final straw that broke her. Ultimately, she chose to do something reckless. Martha had sworn never to reveal the secret, but during one of her confessions, she inadvertently let it slip. Previously, Judd's experience of seeing Jefferson and Martha leaving the confessional wasn't what he had imagined. While Jefferson was listening to confessions, he had secretly uncovered the secret. Jefferson didn't say it directly, but he was clever enough to guess the diamond's hiding place. Knowing that the valuable treasure still existed, he couldn't restrain himself any longer. He set up a forklift, intending to use the cover of darkness to steal the diamond. Martha, recognizing his intentions through his actions, decided to personally stop it all. She approached Sam and Dr. Sharp, using the weaknesses Jefferson had previously used to threaten them as leverage to persuade them to participate. Sam had always helped Jefferson prepare the wine in the bottle. Taking advantage of the opportunity while pouring the wine, Sam secretly replaced it with tranquilizers. After Jefferson fainted, Dr. Sharp, while examining the body, actually murdered him. Sam's death, however, was entirely an accident. Martha had intended to remove the diamond from Prentice's abdomen and hide it forever. The coffin that was brought into the crypt that day didn't contain Jefferson, but Sam. Before burial, they secretly swapped the bodies. Sam entered the crypt and found the diamond in Prentice's remains. After obtaining the item, Dr. Sharp rushed to assist. Unexpectedly, Judd happened to pass by and witnessed the scene. Dr. Sharp hid in the woods. Seeing the diamond, he became greedy. Taking advantage of the moment, Sam knocked Judd unconscious. Sharp ambushed and killed him from behind. When Martha learned of Sam's murder, she suspected Dr. Sharp was responsible. While the police were busy investigating, she sought him out. But he had no intention of sparing her either. He had poisoned the coffee beforehand. While the two were talking, the diamond in Martha's hand accidentally fell to the ground. Sharp instinctively bent down to pick it up. Martha seized the opportunity to exchange 2 cups of coffee. In the end, Sharp drank the poisoned coffee and died. Martha placed Sharp and Jefferson's bodies together in the bathtub, creating a false scenario of Jefferson's ghost seeking revenge. Martha suddenly fainted while speaking. It turned out she had drunk the poisoned coffee a few minutes earlier. She had intended to die with this secret, but when she saw Blanc's gaze on her, she knew her plan had been exposed. But Blancc didn't expose her in front of the crowd. He left this last chance for her to decide her own fate. Before dying, Martha softly confessed her guilt to Judd, then stopped breathing and left the diamond on the ground. After Martha's death, Judd took over the church. He changed everything and used sincerity to win the trust of the believers. He used a dry branch to make a cross. At this time, Cy came to the church wanting to find his father's property, but found nothing. Judd only gave him a cryptic hint about the property. The film ends here. Thank you for watching, goodbye, and see you again.